Sean Haney here with RealAgriculture.com and Real Ag Radio, Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM, joined right now by Carlo Dade of the Canada West Foundation. Carlo, how you doing?
Good to be back.
Yes, indeed it is. Okay, let's talk about Canada-China relations. This has been somewhat of a rocky road. Recently, we told a Chinese diplomat to go back home. We've got a bunch of discussions happening in the mainstream about election interference from the Chinese side. Where exactly is this relationship at this point, Carlo?
Well, you've gone through the political laundry list. I would point out that on the trade or the business side, the relationship continues to grow. Despite the difficulties, despite the tensions, and this has been the case with Australia and the US, trade continues to grow. We had a dip with canola, and canola took a real chunk out of our trade with China. But as that's returned, trade continues to grow. So the political side we're well aware of, but looking at the economic side, businesses and Canadian consumers continue to engage China on a daily basis. So there, the relationship is continuing to grow.
Okay, so if the economic side and the trade side is continuing to grow, why do we have the political side so much it feels in turmoil? Why are these things running in such independent lines?
Man, that's a philosophical question for the ages. I'm going to go back to university and write a PhD on that one. I don't know. The reality is that the political elements do seem to exist in their own reality. And it's reality driven by business. It's reality driven by consumers. The private sector or the government can intervene with this, as the Americans have done in their trade war with China. But even in the case of the U.S., I was just looking at USDA gain figures, and your listeners all know what gain is. I don't have to explain it, but it just shows massive growth of U.S. ag exports to China. There's a reality to the market. There's a reality of what people need and what people produce. And that seems to have a countervailing impact to the political issues and the security issues.
So what's happening in China domestically that it appears that there's increasing trade with Canada? We see Secretary of State Blinken is met with President Xi of China on Monday, trying to find a way to potentially to warm the relationship, maybe reduce some of those tariffs the Americans still have on China going back to the Trump administration. What's at work domestically in China that is creating this need for more trade out of North America?
So, China's an export economy, obviously, a huge producer, but still, they need an international trade system that works. This is how they've lifted 800 million, 900 million people out of absolute poverty, is by engaging in an international system that allows them to move goods and allows investment to come in. So China needs the international system to work. It needs it to work in ways, so we would say, in ways that benefit China. The Chinese would say they need it to work in ways that don't deliberately try to harm China or undermine the success they've had in growing the economy and eradicating poverty. I'm not putting forward a moral relativism argument. I'm just saying that there are two distinct views of how this works. So China needs the international system to work for it to continue to grow and to continue to prosper. So obviously there's engagement on the Chinese side. China also obviously wants the rules rewritten in ways that reflect the reality of having an economy based on state-owned enterprises, an economy based on principles that are different than our version of the free market. That's the contest of our time. How do we accommodate this model of a different economic formation that's being put out by the world's largest economy at purchasing power parity, second largest economy at real GDP? That's a challenge that faces us. This isn't something that we can wish away. It's not the Soviet Union or the ex-USSR. economy with which we didn't engage, that didn't impact us economically. This is the world's largest or second largest economy. And how do we deal with this competing vision of how an economy should be organized and how international trade should work?
Been a lot of talk recently about the UK potentially joining the CPTPP. What about China long term? Do you think they are potential entrant into that agreement?
I think long term, sure. Stretch out the definition of long term long enough.
Okay.
and then I stand a better
That's
chance.
sort of like, will it ever
Right.
rain again? Yes, eventually it will. Yeah.
Though I think parts of Southern California, they may be wondering. I, in the short term, no, there's too much opposition, unfortunately. But I think having China enter an agreement with the huge proviso that they follow the rules, that they actually live up to their promises, having them in a high quality agreement with others like Japan, Chile, Indonesia, or not Indonesia, Chile, Australia, to help us keep China to the rules would be a great thing for Western Canada. Look, it's not just about dealing with China. We're also trying to get into the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, trying to get into those markets as well. Having China bound by a stronger set of rules will help us, not necessarily in selling goods to China, but in dealing with Chinese impacts in these other markets. So even if you're not trading with China and you care less, you're running away from China, you're still going to run into China in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Australia, heck, even in Brazil. So having agreements that kind of bind China or give you some rules in dealing with China would be a huge benefit for Canadian firms that have no interest in going to China, but are looking at these other markets.
But isn't that like a false comfort that they're somehow bound by some rules? Look at what happened. Look at Canada's experience with the CETA agreement in Europe. There's rules, and Europe's constantly used some of those rules as non-tariff trade barriers. So what would lead us to believe that if China was in the agreement, they were somehow bound by these rules and they would have to be honest about some of their trade practices, as we're still, trying to get Canadian beef into the country because of an atypical BSE case that was like a year and a half ago.
Well, yeah, we also don't have enough Canadian beef to sell to the UK, and yet we're complaining about lack of access to the market. Look, the non-tariff barrier issues are prevalent. They become a feature almost of global trade, not a flaw. I say that somewhat facetiously, but they are so prevalent. You look at our relations with the US. If ever we had a reason not to have a trade agreement with the country because they keep violating rules of the agreement or globally violating WTO rules, it would be the Americans. They've got 3 times the violations at the WTO than do the Chinese. So, yeah, we manage this relationship. When country of origin labeling pops up, we lose $1 billion in trade with the US over a year. But we forget that every day, $2 billion a day goes back and forth over the border. We are aware where the system doesn't work, where there's a problem. But if you think about it, every day, $2 billion going back and forth across the border with the US, despite their violation of the NAFTA agreement, despite their WTO rep for being the most flagrant and frequent violator of rules, the rules still allow $2 billion a day. So I would point out that for the vast majority of trade, you will benefit from rules. But the instances where those rules fail will make front page news. But you're never going to see a headline saying, today, another $2 billion crossed the Canada-US border without incident. You're never going to see that headline. But as soon as something bad happens, you're going to see that headline.
Carlo, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. All the best to you, and we'll chat with you again later.
Looking forward to it.